Welcome to the France 24 debate. I'm Mark Owen. Who are the people keeping Vladimir Putin in power? Much is made of the oligarchs and their billions of dollars. Yes, their support's been vital to keeping Putin financed, but how is Putin's influence protected? This is apparently now down to his Saint Petersburg friends, a collection of so-called hard men who are now in positions of power that they owe to Putin. So if Putin's to be deposed, or even more unlikely, democratically voted out of power, the strongmen will do everything they can to stop that. So oligarchs and strongmen, Putin's power protectors, how democracy, freedom and the truth are squashed in Russia today. The guests for this France 24 debate joining us from London, Bill Browder, CEO of Heritage Capital, head of Global Magnitsky Justice Campaign and author of Red Notice, a true story of high finance murder and one man's fight for justice. Thank you, sir, for being with us. Here in the studio, Craig Capitas, contributing editor to Courts and the Daily Beast, regular visitor to our shores, of course, author of Bear Hunting with the Politburo, American Adventures in Russian Capitalism. Craig, pleasure to see you, sir. Joining us from Helsinki, Elizabeth Schinfoster, who's a senior lecturer in sociology and policy at Aston University. Of course, that's in Birmingham in central England. She is author of Rich Russians, From Oligarchs to Bourgeoisie. And as part of that process of writing that, she interviewed 80 Russian millionaires and billionaires. Thank you for being with us. First, with women and children among the casualties in the latest atrocities committed by the Russians in Ukraine, let's take a look at what Putin wants.
Doubling down on his justification for war. In a televised speech, Vladimir Putin again said his goal was to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine.
I repeat, we had no other option for self-defense, for ensuring the security of Russia, except for conducting a special military operation. And of course, all the tasks set will be solved. We will ensure the security of Russia and our people, and we will never allow Ukraine to serve as a springboard for aggressive actions against our country.
Since the start of the war, or what the Russian president has labeled a special military operation, Putin hoped to quickly overrun Ukraine and topple its government, ending for good any hope the country had of joining NATO or the EU and firmly putting the country back under the Russian sphere of influence. But despite what Putin says, there are no Nazis and no genocide, and the war is not going according to plan. Instead, Russian forces have been met with fierce resistance by the Ukrainian military and territorial defense troops. As the fighting rages on, there are signs the Kremlin may be adjusting its goals. As peace talks continue between Moscow and Kyiv, it now appears the Kremlin may have given up on its efforts to overthrow the government and is now willing to talk about the idea of a neutral status for Ukraine. But Russia still wants Ukraine to pledge to never join NATO and to recognize the independence of the eastern separatist regions and acknowledge that Crimea is now part of Russia. Many remain convinced that Putin is not negotiating in good faith, and his latest comments seem to back that up. During his recent address, he warned that if the West thinks that Russia will step back, it does not understand Russia.
So, Catherine Viette, with that roundup, let's bring in our guests then to get some kind of a take on what this situation is then right now. Elizabeth Schinfoster, can I bring you in first from Helsinki there? You interviewed in the process of putting together your publication, something like 80 extremely rich Russian millionaires, billionaires, oligarchs. How did you feel at the end of it? Did these people scare you? Did these people intrigue you? Tell us what you felt.
They intrigued me. They didn't scare me. I think they are more scared now than I would have ever dreamt of being. It's fascinating people, but of course they also played a role in history and of course how they made their money, and then under Putin maintained their money and extended and enlarged it was obviously in cooperation and close harmony with the Kremlin.
And in terms of the influence they had, did you get a sense that they were pulling the strings, or it's not quite as perhaps the public thinks it is?
No, they weren't. They haven't been pulling the strings for a long time. Putin reigned in to the power right from the start in 2000, but nevertheless, they've constantly, of course, advocated their own interests, their own business interests, and they've been part of the whole system. Putin's been in power for that long because he's been the one who was seen as being able to keep the interest of the different elite power groups in balance. And now he seems to be losing the loyalty of the oligarchs, at least those who fell under sanctions. And that will be an interesting situation in the future. As a group, they have power. As individuals, no.
Indeed. Elizabeth, thank you very much indeed. Let's bring in Bill in London, Bill Browder. Head of Global Magnitsky Justice Campaign. Bill, you're in the city that's often referred to as Londongrad or Moscow-on-Thames, given the amount of Russian money that's sloshing through the British capital. What is the perspective you have from there?
Well, so this is truly the offshore Russian center in the world, the money laundering capital of the world, and where all of these oligarchs keep their ill-gotten gains. And the perspective that I have from here is that, for a long period of time, this country gave them a carte blanche to do all this stuff, to keep their money here, no questions asked. And that's all changed in the last 2 weeks. And the government has now come down very hard. They've sanctioned some serious oligarchs. I think there's more oligarchs to be sanctioned. And these guys are absolutely scared, they're terrified, they're petrified, they don't know what to do because the world as they knew it has suddenly changed and changed for a lot worse as far as they're concerned.
Bill, I'm dying to find out what we've got to say. There seems to be a slight problem with your microphone. So whilst we take a look at that, let's take a look at Boris Johnson, of course, under criticism for his well-documented relationship with a rich Russian, Evgeny Lebedev. He, of course, has been given a UK knighthood. It means he must, somewhere along the lines, been made a UK citizen. Otherwise, it wouldn't be possible. Lebedev bought the London Evening newspaper The Standard. He's enjoyed a close friendship with Johnson throughout his time as London Mayor, flag bearer for the Brexit campaign, UK Foreign Secretary, and now as Prime Minister. Well, let's hear Johnson's words on oligarchs.
I can't comment on what individuals are doing, but what we've concluded is that there is enough connection, enough of a link between the Putin regime and the individuals in question to justify the action. And I think when you look at what is happening in Ukraine and you look at the casual rejection of every norm of civilized behavior in bombing a maternity hospital, I think people in this country can see that people connected to the Putin regime need to be sanctioned, and that's what we're doing.
Craig Capitas here in the studio. Craig, Boris Johnson there talking about the nature of why sanctions are taken on oligarchs. But of course, reports of him, blind drunk in Lebedev's chateau in Tuscany give a different kind of perspective, don't they?
Relitigate the buffoonery of Boris Johnson after the war is over. There's a lot of politicians we can hoist from their petard on this. The history of it is significant and important here because London was always their final goal, as Bill pointed out. This whole thing with oligarchs started in the late 1980s, right during Perestroika and Glasnost, when the government allowed what were known as cooperators to start. These were free marketeers. Now, these cooperators had early access to hard currency. And the people who first came in to manage their money were from Cyprus. And the reason for that is that Cyprus was the only country that a Soviet passport could get into without a visa. And the first thing they did in the late 90s, the late 80s, was they went down there and they wanted credit cards, specifically Visa and American Express. And I was on many of these trips. And these fellows in Cyprus would not only come to London to sell these packages, but they would bring with them used clothes from Brooks Brothers to sell to the Soviets who were brought in from the countryside who wanted to be businessmen. That's how it started. And then what happened, these cooperators all had someone called a zashitnik, a protector within the government. They started to feed at the trough. They wanted to wet their beaks. then these cooperators either became oligarchs, got taken over by oligarchs, Mikhail Khodorkovsky being the best example, who started out as a cooperator. I knew him back in the day, okay, and went on to Yukos. And then you come to the 90s with Yeltsin, where the corruption really, really started to gin up. And that's when, and I think this is very important, where Bill was at a crux in this history, because he saw this at Hermitage Capital, and he wanted to change it. And he can tell you the story about the dinner in Davos when we all walked over to the Prime Minister and soon-to-be President, Dmitry Medvedev, and said, hey, you haven't given Bill his visa to get into Moscow. When are you going to do that? And the look on Medvedev's eyes said all you needed to know. The crap was going to hit the fan, because they did not want any outside influence as far as the mechanics of the fiscal exchange. If you wanted to sell refrigerators or bring in oil equipment, that was fine. But no foreigner was going to touch the fiscal mechanics.
Craig, thank you. Bill, can we come back to Bill Browder in London? We're still trying to sort out Bill's microphone, trying to get that sorted. So we'll get back to Bill in a second. Elizabeth Schinfoster in Helsinki, are you hearing us? I hope so.
Yes.
More tales of rich Russians. Now, it's the influence that we're looking at here, isn't it? Sort of how business, I take it, it was impossible to do business in any way, shape or form without some kind of greasing of the palms in power.
Not of that scale and dimension, no. On a lower scale, yes, but not once you've got several billions, no.
And in terms of how, say, for instance, Vladimir Putin is keeping himself in power, how important has that kind of financing been, do you think?
The oligarchs financing Putin, well, Putin would usually take them to task in crisis situation. For example, in 2014, when the sanctions hit after the annexation of Crimea, he would gather them all in the Kremlin and distribute the tasks of where they should open their wallets and take care of. So that's quite handy. In general, however, what I see as something important now is the economy has gone down quite sharply, and even more so drastically in the last year of the pandemic. Living standards have gone down, so they are also big employers, and they don't see how Putin can afford to have all of a sudden 100,000 people out of work and on the streets. So in that sense, they are of importance. And of course, finally, if there was a critical mass of them hit, they were also very likely to pull forces, not something they're by nature very good at doing in their rivals and competitors among themselves. But if there was a critical mass, they would still have all the connections to work on an alternative, or at least facilitate an alternative, which they only, of course, will ever do if it's in their own material interest.
Indeed, that material interest, that them and us mentality, which once upon a time, of course, the whole Russian Revolution back in the day was about getting rid of that. But of course, as we know, with human nature, it's not that easy. And of course, when the system is set up to be corrupt as it is, then it doesn't happen at all. Elizabeth, thank you very much indeed. Elizabeth Schinfoster there in Helsinki, who wrote that book, having spoken to some 80 oligarchs, very rich Russians, millionaires, billionaires. There is, of course, a whole movement against the war developing in Russia. Many people have been arrested. And, of course, one person took their courage in their hands and staged a protest on Channel 1 TV. She's Marina Ovsinikova. She's spoken to France 24 today, the TV producer who staged this courageous live protest against the Ukraine invasion. Against, she said, lies being told by Russian media, including her employer. And against Vladimir Putin, no war, she cried out. That would be enough to get anybody a 15-year jail sentence. She was fined and released by a Moscow court. There are fears, though, for her safety going forward from now on. She spoke to us a little earlier.
As I've said, it is the war in Ukraine that really is the point of no return. This was the trigger People never thought such a thing could happen. They never thought it was possible. On February 24th, I stopped sleeping. I lost all sense of direction in my life. I couldn't eat, and I understood that I couldn't remain silent. I learned about this new law that makes it possible to detain any people demonstrating in the street, and I decided that I should join these events. I should join these protests.
So Marina Ovsinikova there speaking about her motivation, and many people are concerned about what happens to her next, Craig. And it's not the oligarchs that might get to her, but it's the other side of this equation, isn't it? The sort of the hard man apparatus, the enforcers, the people who, basically rub people out. They're the ones that might be the next threat for her safety, for the safety of other dissenters.
Well, they are. You have the hard men, Putin's cronies from his days in Saint Petersburg, buttressed by his KGB pals. Plus, you have the apparatchiks who, don't know which way the wind is blowing, but will stick with Putin for as long as possible. And the other factor, which a lot of people discount, which to me is perhaps the most important factor, is the Russian Orthodox Church, which has 90 million faithful followers in a country of 144 million, and you have an Archbishop Kirill who's siding with Putin on all of this, and doing so quite virulently on the airwaves and in his sermons. Zelensky is winning the television war. He is, but that's not the real war. It looks real good when you seize a yacht. Makes great TV, doesn't it? And it has some metaphorical value. But it's really just scratching the surface. I've been spending time over the past few days with lawyers and liquidators. And they're saying, who's going to buy the yachts? They're just going to sit there. Who's going to want a Russian oligarch's yacht, let alone want one? But we run these out as part of the television war. But it goes really, really much deeper here, Mark.
You mentioned the yacht. I can obviously quote the yacht that belongs to Alisher Usmanov, who's got a fortune of $18 billion in his back pocket, we're told. The yacht cost something like $600 million to build. It was seized in Hamburg. It was up for repairs or refitting. And of course, that's all now sort of in the hands of German customs. Right. It's there, that kind of thing. Of course, that would equate to the sort of the cost of a modern day sports stadium, that kind of 600 million. It's phenomenal figures to think about. And one thinks about the influence that he might have. If he were to speak to Putin and say, listen, Vladimir, this is really
he's not going to do that. The oligarchs, as Elizabeth was pointing out, and I thought she was being quite diplomatic, bless her heart. The oligarchs just don't dislike each other. They're like a bag of weasels. They can't stand each other. They'll rip each other's throats out if they can. So forget about the oligarchs doing anything to defenestrate Putin. They're not going to do a darn thing. They're going to run and hide under the nearest bed.
I'm worried about someone defenestrating the poor girl who actually had the guts to demonstrate and to sort of do that stunt on Channel 1. That's what I'm kind of really worried about, because we hear of people, politicians, dissenters, being taken out in Russia. I think it's fair to say that. I don't think I'm imagining this happens. I think it's accepted that this has been happening. I'm worried about sort of what happens to her, and where's it going to come from? And is it going to come from these people who are backing Putin?
There's a Russian expression, retired for reasons of health. I would expect that's what's going to happen to this brave young television producer.
Okay. Alexei Navalny, another, obviously, dissenter, very famously in jail right now. Elizabeth, can I bring you back in to maybe get more of an insight into the oligarchs? I mentioned Alisher Usmanov with his mega yacht, super yacht, call it what you like. His involvement in English football to some degree or another, it's disputed as to whether he has influence there or not, but certainly he's around, mentioned in all the reports. Roman Abramovich, the other one, of course, with Chelsea Football Club. these people, do you think they have any kind of real influence with Putin? Do you think they could actually speak to him, have a word in his ear, change policy in some way? Is it possible?
Well, as I said before, yes, if they act as a collective, they can't act on their own. We've seen that in 2008, when Deripaska and Vekselberg were sanctioned in the US. It was very painful for the two. It is certainly very painful for the few that are oligarchs on the sanction list now. But there are not actually that many. Just one thing, maybe, when Bill has his microphone sorted.
He's back. He's with us. He's hearing you. Carry on.
What I would like to ask him is how he sees, why he sees the UK government now coming down so harsh on the oligarchs. I can see them. I counted the oligarchs that actually are oligarchs and not the Putin cronies and state managers, very overpaid, but basically Putin's flesh and blood, who also are there because Putin trusts them. But the oligarchs who are dependent, for that, whom it's essential to have a second leg into a different world, for whom it's absolute hell the idea that they might be completely at the mercy of the Kremlin and Putin. I can't yet see how the UK has any rigidly come down on them. I counted yesterday with the list, with the additional names Johnson published, the UK government published a couple of days ago. We come up to 13 people, but a lot of the very big names are still missing, and some of the names that now are on the list seem slightly random. And another thing what I want to say, Greg, the yachts, that's a fantastic thing. I think it's so good for public consumption who want to see and are entertained by luxury items and property. But if you say Usmanov, 80 billions he has, and then he's got this, several hundred millions that go down the drain. And of course, it's also painful to have a new yacht built. There are long queues, it takes ages, especially if you have special demands on what it would look like. But in comparison to what else is happening to those people, it's pretty much peanuts. I will say for the oligarchs, the absolute worst thing that can happen is not to be able to jump onto the private jets and get out of Russia in a situation where they see it could get difficult for them. A, B, if you look, for example, at the UK and Piotr Arven, someone who's invested so much effort, years with his art collection, lending some of the objects to the best museums with his name tag on it. And now from one day to the next, he is persona non grata. All his work, his efforts gone. And he's turned into basically,
So, Elizabeth, your question to Bill Browder, if I'm understanding you correctly, is the one that I was about to put to him. So, great minds thinking alike here. I'll get that shine from you and hand it over to me. Bill, I think the question is there a kind of a duplicity in the way the British government is now saying one thing about oligarchs when, in fact, they've been rubbing shoulders and maybe even more for a long time in Londongrad or Moscow-on-Thames?
Yeah, of course there is. It's horrifying how these oligarchs were feted, celebrated, invited, and their dirty money was never questioned here in London. It's been a shame on this country. But at the same time, we can look back on history and be furious about it, and I am, but we're in the middle of a major existential crisis right now, with with Putin butchering children and women and bombs and just the most horrible stuff. And we have to react to that, and we are reacting to that. And I think that the British government, in their first few weeks now, has done a reasonably good job. And believe me, I'm no fan of the British government. I'm here criticizing them left, right, and center. But if you look at the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia, on Putin, and on the oligarchs, it's starting to hit. The central bank reserves have been frozen. The 70% of the banks have been cut off from SWIFT. about a dozen, maybe coming up to 24 oligarchs sanctioned. The companies are pulling out. BP has pulled out. Other big British companies are pulling out. And so things are starting to happen, and I think it's going to have a big effect on Putin. I think it already is. I don't think anyone could have ever imagined. I don't think he could have imagined. I don't think his oligarchs could have ever imagined that this would happen. And this will, if done properly, and it's not done yet. As I said, 70% of the banks are cut off from SWIFT. We need 100% of the banks cut off from SWIFT. Dozen coming on to 24 oligarchs sanctioned. We need 100 oligarchs sanctioned. Some companies have pulled out. All the companies need to pull out. And the reason for all of this is that we need to completely starve Putin of money so that he can't fund this war. Mm-hmm. And I think we're on the path to getting there, but we have to be even more on the path, because as long as we're insisting that we're not going to go and help the Ukrainians being butchered by the Russians, then this is the best we can do. We better do it better.
Bill, thank you very much indeed. I'm just struck as you were talking and we were thinking about the amounts of money involved with these oligarchs, Craig. I mean, the yacht that Usmanov had confiscated nearly amounts to the amount of aid that Biden signed over to Ukraine yesterday, $800 million, more or less. It's that kind of figure. Stunning, isn't it?
It's stunning, but as Elizabeth pointed out, she used a magic number, 80 billion, and she's probably not even close once this whole thing washes out. The one truth, ultimate truth in all of this, because everything coming out of Russia is a rumor decorated with wisps of truth. That's Russia. But the real truth, the singular truth here, is that this did blindside Putin. It blindsided him really, really badly, because he thought he had bought off everyone in the West. That was his plan from day one, from the moment he took power from Yeltsin, having made a deal with him. Let me in, and we're not going to prosecute you and your family for wetting your beaks for all those years at the trough. And that was the deal. And guess what? It didn't work out for him. But you're getting into territory now that's really interesting. If I may, I have a son at Tulane Law School, okay? And we were talking about this the other day. And Charles said to me, he says, Dad, we're looking at what he calls the lawyering difference now. If you worked or ran a Russian company, okay, were you really a subsidiary of Putin Inc. in a court of law? Now, these are the kinds of questions that are going to be addressed going forward. If Putin and his guys can get legal representation or pay for it, they might have to use public defenders, who knows? But these are the kind of questions, because for all the horror of Vladimir Putin and what he's created, it is a fiat state. It is a nation. He can make whatever laws he wants. And the deal he cut with the West, tacitly or not, was, you take all our money and make lots of money and let our guys go and you can make profits. Just leave us alone here in Russia and we're not going to bother you. And that was the big lie, because from day one, Putin started making mischief in the West. That was the deal. And it was there, and people pointed it out, principal among them Bill, and no one listened. No one listened. This, I said, we're not litigating this. That's for later. But this has been apparent for 22 years. But the money was so big, so huge, that people put blinders on, okay? And when Bill, I think he was off air before when we said this, when Bill in the 90s, and I saw this, I reported this, at Hermitage Capital said, hey, something stinks here. And he goes to the government and he says, we got to clean this up. And what did they do? They ran him out of town on a rail and they liquidated his chief accountant lawyer, essentially. That's what they did. And no one batted an eye.
Bill, do you want to come back on that one?
Yeah, I mean, it was a shocking culture that we had over the last 20 years. And, you know, Craig, thank you for mentioning my lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, who was murdered. But, you know, we also, I mean, here in Britain, we had this, you know, poisoning of Sergei Skripal in Salisbury with Novichok, a banned chemical nerve agent, where they had to close the whole town of Salisbury down for like a week with hazmat suits and chemical, you know, detectors and all this kind of stuff. One person died, several were hospitalized, and then 6 months later, all sorts of people from the UK were going to the World Cup in Moscow. I mean, there was never been any consequence to any of the bad stuff that they've done. I mean, just, you know, they shoot down MH17, no consequence. They invade Georgia, no consequence. They take Crimea, no consequence. And the reason for that is that there were so many people who had been corrupted, that had been put on the payroll, so that we ended up in this terrible situation where Putin could kind of do everything and anything he wanted. And as Craig said, you know, he thought that this would carry on, that he was going to go into Ukraine, and you know, we might slap some token sanctions on him, but nothing serious. And I think that what's happened in Ukraine is crossed the Rubicon. You know, why is it now versus all the other terrible things he's done? I don't know. Now is terrible, but so is some of the other stuff he's done. But okay, now he's crossed the Rubicon, and he is now in a place that he never could imagine he would be in, where the entire world has turned on him, where all these people he cultivated have distanced themselves from him. You no longer have Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, doing his bidding. You no longer have BP doing his bidding. It's everybody has abandoned him, and he's shocked.
You mentioned the airline that shot down over Ukraine, Bill. A colleague of mine was on board that, former colleague of mine called Glenn Thomas. I mean, the range of how people get affected by what has gone on over these years, it is actually a whole web, isn't it? A very tangled and very insidious web that's been constructed. And in many ways, I think, as you were saying, Craig, it's because people who could have acted at some point basically chose to close their eyes, close their mouths, and just put their hands out.
And if running a lot of TV footage of yachts being seized opens up people's eyes who've never looked at this before, then run more footage. Please, Mark. Tell the studio to run it right now, because this is very, very serious stuff.
Let's bring Elizabeth back in Helsinki. Elizabeth, of course, spoke to some 80 Russian millionaires and billionaires as part of her book, Rich Russians from Oligarchs to Bourgeoisie. Elizabeth lectures at Aston University in Birmingham. Elizabeth Schinfoster, in terms of where we are now, we've discussed about the rich, super rich, mega rich oligarchs. We've discussed about the hard men, enforcers, those who are coming up and again becoming rich in the process. Is it all about this kind of grace and favour setup in Russia, which has created this wheel of corruption, which is going around and all circling around Putin? How does it stop? Is it possible to stop it? Is this miscalculation by Putin going to be the one thing, perhaps, that derails his whole machine?
Interesting question, yeah. I mean, the whole origin of money of those oligarchs is, we can compare them to the robber barons of the late 19th century in the US, who then also cleverly, if we hear their names now, Carnegie, Mellon, Rockefeller, we think of libraries and foundations and so on. So that now changing, it will be interesting what is left for them. What I'm curious about is what's going to happen with the young generation. So those who came to age just recently, grown up under Putin. Many of them, of course, study in the West, live in the West, and by now also have acquired all political correctness. It's a new phenomenon in terms of not being sexist, not being homophobic, not being racist. But what they still up to before the war were hanging on to was that they supported Putin, which totally makes sense. It's an arrogant idea of the West to think because they go through our schools and universities, they will go home and build democracy. Why should they? And the rationale supporting Putin until recently was they could see Putin in power, creating a system so stable where their families, their family fortune empires could just grow. So now that has stopped. It will be interesting to see how the whole, again, again, in bigger numbers, those people will respond, and especially also the young generation. Putin himself in the country, man, is grim. Just with the announcement from yesterday, there is obviously a long leeway, many options to become more repressive, and in terms of media, in terms of culture, in terms of all kinds of things. Brain drain, of course, alongside. It's going to be Middle Ages.
Elizabeth,
hopefully not for long.
Elizabeth, thank you very much indeed. Elizabeth Schinfoster there joining us from Helsinki. Bill, I'm coming to you for what's probably going to be the final comment. Antony Blinken just warning China that it will bear responsibility if it supports Russia's aggression. China's position, we don't quite know what's going to happen next. But is it this idea that the oligarchs could be sort of wrong-footed, they could start to lose their cash, they could start to lose their footing, that might weaken in some way Putin's grip?
I don't think that the oligarchs have ever strengthened Putin's grip. I think that the oligarchs are there for the benefit of Putin in terms of holding cash, in terms of giving him money, in terms of buying him things, in terms of doing him services. But the oligarchs have no power over Putin. The oligarchs are there at his pleasure. They can be arrested, they can have their money taken away, and they can be killed with a stroke of the pen of Vladimir Putin. They all know that. They're all petrified of him. And, in terms of China, I think this is really one of the crucial issues, because we've cut off lending to Russia, we've cut off the central bank reserves, we've cut off the money that Putin holds through the oligarchs and their offshore cash. We're starting to cut off some of the flow of revenues from foreign purchases from Russia. And so Russia, and the economists are all saying that there's about a 30% GDP contraction coming up, meaning effectively that Russia is going to face a Great Depression. And Putin is going to need money in the future to run his war, which is costing $1 billion or $2 billion a day. He's going to need money to keep people from starving to death. And so China is the lender of last resort. And the question is, will China be able to give him enough money? And what does he have to give to China in return to get their money? And I mean, the irony of this whole thing is that Ukraine is really a country with not much. There's no natural resources. There's not a whole lot of anything. And if you look at this globally, geostrategically, over a long period of time, Putin should be afraid of China, and he's now going to basically have to put his country into hock to China in order to fight this war with this little country next door that's pretty poor, that there's nothing really to get there. And so it's a spectacular miscalculation, strategic error, and unpatriotic thing that Putin is doing in this by going into Ukraine and putting himself in this crazy, vulnerable position.
Bill Browder, CEO of Heritage Capital, head of Global Magnitsky Justice Campaign. Thank you so very much for your insight. Thanks for joining us. Thanks to Elizabeth Schinfoster in Helsinki, senior lecturer at Aston in Birmingham and author of Rich Russians from Oligarchs to Bourgeoisie. And thanks to Craig Capitas here in the studio of Quartz, where he is contributing editor, and The Daily Beast. Craig, always a pleasure to see you, sir.
Thank you.
Thanks to you, of course, most of all, for watching wherever you are. Our coverage, minute by minute, of events in Ukraine continues here in France 24. Stay with us.